Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're not as full as our last sessions, but people just come in and sit wherever when you start. So thank you so much for coming today. We hope that we will be able to answer your questions on the University Pension Plan. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. We are on traditional, we'd like to honor the Indigenous peoples on whose traditional lands Queen's University is built. My name is Donna Janiak, and I'm the Vice Principal Finance and Administration for Queen's University. I'm happy to be here today. I'm only going to do a brief introduction and then moderate questions at the end, but I'm very happy to have my colleagues Elizabeth and Alan here, and I'll let them introduce themselves because they will be giving the presentation today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Brown, and I'm a pension lawyer. I've been working with Queen's University for a number of years on pension matters, and more recently with the University of Toronto, Guelph, and Queen's on this University Pension Plan project. Glad to be here.
And good afternoon. I'm Alan Shapira. I'm an actuary with Aon, and I work on, I'm the actuary for a number of pension plans in the university sector, and I've been the actuarial advisor to the universities in their collaborative effort with the employee groups on creating this UPP.
Thanks, Alan and Elizabeth. So we have a detailed presentation that Alan and Elizabeth will go through, but I wanted to let you know that it is on the University Pension Plan website, so you will be able to get access to the pension plan because we did a town hall on November 22nd. It's already on the University Pension Plan website, so it's all there for you. So just to give a little bit of context, we've been working with the employee groups for a number of years. I mean, it seems as though this has been an ongoing project for some time to try to form a jointly sponsored pension plan that will allow us to have a sustainable pension plan for years to come, for the future, for us and for future employees of Queen's University. The defined benefit plan, which ours is a hybrid plan, and Alan will go through it, but the defined benefit plan is not as prevalent outside of the public sector anymore. And so we're really trying to be proactive together with the employee groups to keep a really good defined benefit plan for all of us into the future. And so you know, we believe, and the way the markets have been going and everything has been going, but that our current plan is not sustainable. So the status quo is not an option. So we believe that this is the best solution, but really it is up to everyone to take a good look at the plan and for us to show you why we believe that this is the best option going forward. Many governments are starting to legislate changes to the pension plan environment, and we want to be proactive so that we're out there and we're getting a great plan for the future, and it will help with recruitment, retention, and so on with faculty and staff at Queen's. The other thing that I would say is that jointly sponsored pension plans are globally recognized as a proven model for generating higher returns and more stable investment opportunities by pooling funds across a large membership base. It's the same model used by such plans as the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, OMERS, which is for municipal employees, and HOOP, which is for hospital employees. The proposed jointly sponsored pension plan, the University Pension Plan, will involve the merger of the existing plans at University of Toronto, University of Guelph, and Queen's, 3 universities. The University of Guelph actually has 3 plans, and so it's 5 plans that we're merging into the University Pension Plan, and that's the intention if we get consent. Once established, the new plan will be open for all other Ontario universities to join, and that's where we get at the concept of a larger investment base, more opportunities, greater efficiencies in this jointly sponsored pension plan. And as Alan and Elizabeth will show you, we think that there are many advantages in this new plan in terms of benefits, but also in terms of governance and transparency, and being authors of our own future in terms of pension plans. So today we're going to look at what that plan looks like, and I'll wrap up. But I think in closing, I want to say that this is really because the status quo is not sustainable, and so we're really looking to keep our defined benefit plans for the future. So I'm going to turn it over to Alan and Elizabeth to take us through what we have agreed to with the employee groups as the plan design and the plan governance, and then there'll be lots of opportunity for questions after. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon again. I'm delighted to be here, and I thank you for taking the time this afternoon to join us and to listen to the presentation. For Elizabeth and I, this is Town Hall across the three universities number 16. So we're still excited to be doing this. There are people, though, in the room that have been at various town halls with us, and this be maybe number 5 or 7 or 10 for them. So I'm not sure they're as excited to hear us as we are to be here. This is an important topic, so we wanted to devote the appropriate amount of time to it. And to that end, we tried to separate the presentation into 3 parts to try to give you a perspective of what we're trying to do here. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about why we've undertaken this initiative of a jointly sponsored pension plan. And as mentioned, it is a collaborative effort between the university administrations and the employee groups. And we entered this project with a collective view, that our job was to be able to continue to provide good pensions to faculty and staff in the university sector. That was the goal of what we were trying to do here. And I think that's really important at the outset to say that was the initial goal. The next part of the presentation, I'll spend some time talking about the details of the university pension plan. It's referred to as the UPP. I'll talk a little bit about how the Queen's University pension plan, which we call the QPP, goes into the UPP. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll give you some examples, and I'll also talk about the contribution rates and how, in main part, how everything fits together. And then I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth, who's going to talk about governance as well as the regulatory process and consent process. But I'm going to be up here for a while, so as they say on the flight, sit back and relax and enjoy the ride. No one laughed this morning either. So let me talk about what a jointly sponsored pension plan is, because I think it's really important as a starting point to understand the nature of the plan. It is by definition, it's a defined type of plan in the Pension Benefits Act, which is the legislation that governs pensions in Ontario. And it is defined in the legislation as a defined benefit plan. So the basic benefit structure of the plan has to be the type of plan that provides members with a pension that is based on a formula, their years of service in the plan, as well as the earnings near retirement. The other part of it that is key is that it's jointly sponsored, jointly funded, and jointly governed by the employees and the university. So the joint word means everything is from sponsorship to funding to governance is shared. Donna mentioned some of the large plans in Ontario. The 5 up on the screen are the largest. They're very well known, not only in Ontario or in Canada, but globally. There was a recent World Bank Group report that focused on what they call the Canadian pension model, which is essentially this jointly sponsored model, and how these plans have really worked to provide a solid foundation for retirement income in the public sector in Ontario and across Canada. So with that background, a bit of a good segue into why are we talking about a JSPP. And so I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on some of the points that Donna made. First of all, I should go back to this point about this being a tried and true model that currently exists not only in Ontario, but across the country. As a matter of fact, the academics in the Alberta university system at the 5 universities in Alberta are actually participate in a jointly sponsored pension plan. So the academic pension plan in Alberta is a JSPP. So there are, this is a model that we can go and talk to people about how it works, what best practices are, what they think they've learned as they've gone through their journey, and we did just that. I mean, if both the university administrations and the employee groups met together with representatives of those 5 plans to be able to understand better how to create this plan and run it efficiently. So there's the tried and true model. The second group of reasons would fall under the financial perspective, and there's a couple of elements to that. One is the financial environment we find ourselves in, and when we started, as Donna mentioned, when we started looking at some of the issues around the Queen's Pension Plan, 2011, 2012, I mean, there was some hope that interest rates would rise, not fall, and since that point in time, interest rates have actually gone down even further. And while they're increasing a little bit right now, the fact of the matter is that they have been low and are likely to be low for a long period of time. And well, what does that mean? Well, it means that the expected investment return that we can get from investing the pension fund assets is more challenging to get to a level that we need to keep the funding equation in balance. And that funding equation has really been, in typical pension plans in the Ontario University sector, about 1/3 of the cost of a pension coming from member and university contributions and 2/3 from investment income. So obviously the investment income is hugely important in creating a funding equation that makes pension plans affordable, and to the extent we're more challenged every year to be able to get the kinds of returns we need to think of new ways of doing that. The second part of that is, so that's for the contributions going in and the investment income being earned. On the other side, the pensions being paid out are being paid out for a longer period of time. The good news is that everyone is living longer, but from a pension perspective, it means pensions are payable for a longer period of time. The second financial reason is around the Ontario funding rules for pension plans, and they are really established from the perspective of a single employer sponsoring a pension plan, and that single employer having a risk of becoming insolvent. Example, Sears. And so what that means is the funding rules are designed to try to ensure that contributions go in to meet that solvency, that situation where the underlying employer becomes insolvent. That creates a lot of funding strain on university pension plans, especially when those pension plans are very unlikely to wind up because of employer insolvency. So we have a set of funding rules in Ontario that aren't really helpful for university pension plans. As a matter of fact, in other provinces across the country, the universities in a number of provinces have been exempted from solvency funding. Ontario has not done that, so we have that issue to deal with. The third element is what I would call environmental factors, things in the environment in general that create some challenges for us. One of them is that, as Donna mentioned, pensions in the private sector, defined benefit plans are declining and perhaps even disappearing. Pensions in general are not nearly as good as they used to be in the private sector. And so you're saying, well, why do I care about what's going on in the private sector? And I think the answer to that question is because that disappearance of pension coverage in the private sector is putting a lot of pressure on the public sector in terms of the cost and the risk structure of their pension plans. And we've already seen some of that because in Quebec, as an example, the Quebec government imposed on the Quebec universities a 50-50 sharing model, cost and risk, and also put a cap on the contributions that could be made to a university pension plan, meaning that if you were over that level, you had to reduce your benefits. So mandated in Quebec. In Alberta, I mentioned the academics are already in a JSPP, but most of their other large public sector plans are not JSPPs, and they just introduced legislation within the last month to convert those plans from single employer plans or larger plans where the employer is the plan sponsor and the administrator to the jointly sponsored model. So we're seeing the trend across the country, and part of that comes from the pressure of trying to find a model where the public sector can say we have a sustainable model, even though the private sector is not doing very much in this area. And the last element is the Ontario government. In 2012, they put out in their budget that pension plans in the broader public sector, including university plans, should be targeting to get to 50-50 sharing of cost. And that's been underway in the sector for some time. And in the recent fall economic statement that just came out, they actually specifically mentioned this university sector pension project, their support for the JSPP model, and an indication that if we get this set up, this plan would get the solvency funding exemptions that other JSPPs get. It's not automatic, you have to apply for it. That would get the solvency funding exemption that the other JSPPs would get in order that we can find a sustainable way to fund plans in the sector. So the top bullet about protecting the defined benefit model is the issue here for us has been collectively, university administrations and employee groups, is that we don't want to have mandated on us a model that isn't developed by university administrations and their employee groups and through a bargaining process. We don't want mandated plans for the university sector. And we think there is a clear and present danger that there'll be some pressure of some sort on pension plans in the university sector from the last government, this government, and a future government. So we're really trying to protect the model going forward. The other part of it, though, is this is becoming the model for running pension plans going forward. And there's two aspects of the model that make it successful. The first one is there's an alignment of interest between all the stakeholders in terms of both cost and risk and say in governance. So there's that alignment of interest that's turned out to be a very important aspect of the JSPP model. And as Elizabeth will talk about, you'll see some of the transparency that comes from that. And the second part of it is it's becoming the model where we can try to achieve the highest level of efficiency and sophistication in providing, investing the assets of the plan and providing services to members and in a way that we get the best bang for the contribution buck. So it's the structure itself and it's the efficiencies and sophistication that comes with it. I'm going to talk about risk throughout the session, and essentially in any pension plan, we set contributions at a particular level. If it turns out those contributions aren't sufficient to provide the benefit, there are deficits arising. And in a single employer world, like the current plan, those deficits are borne all by the university. In a JSPP, they're shared. At the same time, on the reward side, to the extent the contributions turn out to be more than enough to provide the benefits, then there are funding excesses, and those can be shared as well through reduced contributions or increases in benefits. So it is a model that shares both the downside and the upside. This is not a new risk. It exists today. To the extent that the university, and over the last, probably since 2008, I think the university's put in $114 million of additional payments into the plan for funding shortfalls. To the extent that the $114 million has to go in the plan, it comes out of operating budget for purposes of running the university and fulfilling the academic mission. So there's clearly a risk that already exists, and we're trying to define it more within the pension plan. I talked about the reliefs for some of the funding pressures if we can get that solvency exemption. And you know, the last point I would make is, as Donna said, that once we get this set up, the intent is to broaden it out to more universities. So we do have the three universities that have been mentioned, Queen's, U of T, and University of Guelph. We've been working with their faculty associations at each university, the steelworkers, which happens to represent the administrative staff across all three of those institutions, the representatives from the non-unionized employees, and we have been working towards developing this plan for these three universities as the starting participants in the plan. There are other unions within each university. that represent employees, and they are considering their participation. I mentioned that the government certainly is encouraged us, and we would like to do it, is have other universities join. There are at least 2 or 3 that are very interested in joining once we're set up, but longer term we expect more and more universities in the sector. Some of those big plans I talked about, they didn't start out with everyone in their sector in their plan. So when the HOOP has hundreds and hundreds of employers in the Healthcare of Ontario pension plan, it probably started with less than 100 because they didn't have everyone in the plan. So it takes time to build up the participation. So let me now turn to the UPP, and I'm going to talk some of the details. I'm going to go and look at it from 3 perspectives, sort of the big picture perspective of how we're going to fit everything together. Then I'm going to go into some of the details around individual levels of benefits and those types of things, then I have some examples. And I'm going to take a little bit of water before I go on to the next. Actually, I have to open the water. Okay, big picture. We're going to take the assets from the 3 universities, the 5 plans, pension plans that were mentioned. And when this is all approved, and Elizabeth's going to tell you that process, we're going to take all those assets for the 3 universities. It would be about $10 billion. We're going to put that in one pension fund for those 3 universities managed by this new plan. And as other universities join, their assets will come into the plan as well. If the entire sector joined, it would be probably over $20 billion, maybe as high as $25 billion of assets across the sector. But initially, a sizable plan at $10 billion. At the same time, even though you will see in a minute that there are different benefit structures for service being transferred in, as well as service being earned in the future, even though there's going to be a difference, the entire plan, both from the past and the future, is going to be sponsored and governed jointly with the members and the universities. So we have one pension fund, we have one joint sponsorship and governance structure. Then we have to deal with, we're transferring some benefits into the plan, and we're going to start earning new benefits going forward. And for the benefits being transferred into the plan that you've earned under the Queen's Pension Plan, the QPP, there's 2 important points. First one, all the benefits that have been earned to date, the date this conversion goes ahead, I'll talk about that in a minute, all those accrued benefits are protected and transferred into the UPP. So the benefit, your accrued benefit or your earned benefit, for another way of saying it, on the day before the conversion and the day after the conversion for that Queen's service will look exactly the same. We've gone a little bit farther than that and said, for that service being transferred in, so if you have 15 years at Queen's or 20 years at Queen's and we're transferring that into the UPP, for that service being transferred in, we are going to use the Queen's hybrid structure, and I'll explain that in a minute, for purposes of determining your benefits for that period of service. So we're going to port those provisions into this new plan. And so we'll do your calculation at retirement based on your service transferred in and based on the Queen's provisions. We're going to then add to that a set of benefit provisions that we've harmonized across all the universities participating in the plan for all of the employees at those universities. And so you can imagine that at any particular, across the sector, there are multiple differences in benefit provisions across the sector, and we had to find a way, working with the employee groups, to harmonize those so we could get one set of benefits going forward. And that's what we have done. Everyone in the plan going forward, same set of benefits. Everyone in the plan that came from a particular university has those benefit provisions attached to them. You see the date up there of July 1, 2021. We'll explain why we're using that date, but for all intents and purposes, as you sit here, you need to think that I will continue to earn pension benefits in the Queen's University plan until July 1, 2021. At that point, then those benefits will be transferred into the UPP, and I'll move over to the UPP set of provisions for service going forward. I should mention that if there are any pensioners, retirees in the hall today, that accrued benefit protection applies to the pension that you're receiving now. It will be transferred into the UPP on July 1, 2021. The indexation provisions that you currently have attached to it, which deal with the rate of return, the fund rate of return in excess of 6%, that will move over with it as well. So from a retiree perspective, you won't see any change in your pension amount. You won't see any change in the terms that apply to that as well. We then have to look at the fact where we're going to take all those assets, we're going to transfer them into the new plan. At the same time, we have liabilities that go with it. That's the obligations we have to all the individuals in the plan for pension benefits earned to date. We're going to move that into the new plan. It may very well be that at the time we do that, the assets of a particular university's pension plans are not sufficient to cover the liabilities, in which case we would have an initial going concern deficit. Early on in the process, we agreed to a principle that said for any deficits being transferred in to the plan, that those deficits would remain the responsibility of the university, and they would be funded over a 15-year period after the conversion date with fixed payments over that period. The key from a member perspective is those deficits will have no impact on the funding of the plan going forward. And from a university perspective, each university bears its own deficit, and there'll be no cross-subsidization between universities in terms of one university paying off someone else's deficit. So we've kept it clean from that perspective. Good for the members, good for the universities. And to the extent that assets and liabilities that we bring in and that deficit is an estimate at a point in time, to the extent that estimate is actually too high or too low, there's a protocol for dealing with the university continuing to remain responsible for that for some period of time. As we move forward, we have one joint cost and risk sharing arrangement where costs and risk are shared 50-50 with all the universities in the plan combined in determining that. And so I said earlier that I define risk a little bit more for you, and so we've set, you'll see, some contribution rates to provide the benefits under this plan. And as I mentioned, if it turns out that experience the assumptions on which we base those contribution rates, if experience is different from that over a long period of time, it may result in contribution rates going up, may result in contribution rates coming down. But that is a process that is worked through with the plan sponsors, as Elizabeth will tell you, and it's shared 50-50, and it's done within the pension plan. So then let me bring it down a little more towards the Queen's University pension plan. And as been mentioned, you have what is called a hybrid pension plan, and by that, the definition is that there are two components to the pension plan. There is a money purchase component or a defined contribution component where you and the university contribute to an account under the plan. That account earns investment earnings. When you reach retirement, that account balance can be converted to a pension. That pension is then payable over your lifetime with the appropriate survivor benefits. At the same time, that will be compared against a defined benefit provision that serves as the minimum guarantee. So to the extent that that defined benefit provision provides more than the money purchase component, there'll be a top-up to your pension from that minimum guarantee benefit. To the extent it doesn't, you'll just continue to receive the entire money purchase pension. With the changeover to the new plan, we're not going to have that model going forward, but that model is protected for the past. So we'll take your existing account balances, they'll move to the new plan, they'll continue to earn investment earnings, they'll be continue to convert it to a pension at retirement. The difference will be that no new contributions will be going in to those account balances because they'll be going into the new set of provisions. So then we turn to the new set of provisions for future service, and it is defined benefit only. So we are removing the minimum, the money purchase component of the plan, and you'll see because we are doing that, there's some increases in the defined benefit provisions themselves to make up for the fact that it's not the greater of going forward. But I think, just again to reiterate, the existing account balances and all the existing terms around how you convert that to a pension move over for past service into the UPP. So I'm going to take about 5 or 6 slides now to just compare the defined benefit provisions under the UPP, which are for future service, to the minimum guarantee provisions that apply for the service you bring in from the Queen's Plan. And I realize that in doing that, for individuals, many individuals perhaps, there are points in time, depending on where the markets are, where the money purchase pension, the pension that's being created from your account balance, is greater than this minimum guarantee. The problem is that will be different for everyone in this room. It'll be different for everyone in the plan. It'll depend on when they started in the plan, what the contribution levels were, and how much investment income has been, or what period were they here, where the market's good, where the market's bad, what age did they convert their pension, did they have a spouse? There's just so many variables, and so while the defined contribution or money purchase account may be higher, we think that the benefit improvements on the formula make up for the elimination of that. So you can see under the Queen's pension plan, most pension plans in Canada have a different benefit rate on earnings up to the year's maximum pensionable earnings, which is the wage base under the Canada Pension Plan. That's around $56,000 this year, and it's the earnings on which you and the university make contributions and which you receive Canada Pension Plan benefits. And under the Queen's Plan, that benefit rate is 1.4% of your best average earnings below the average CPP wage base and 1.8% above. And it might impact people in this room, there is a maximum pension that can be payable from a registered plan, and so under the Income Tax Act, that overlays that pension formula. For service after you move into the UPP, the formula on the right-hand side of the page would apply. We're going to add those two pieces together when you retire, and then you receive one pension with the two pieces. The benefit formula, the 1.4 has moved up to 1.6%. And the 1.8% has moved up to 2%. So the benefit formula will generate a higher pension. You still have the Income Tax Act maximum pension to deal with, and so to the extent you're impacted by the income tax maximum pension, there's some limitation on how much improvement there would be from going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. But again, remember, the left-hand side stays there for you for past service. The right-hand side is for future service. I mentioned best average earnings. The current plan uses the best 48 consecutive months. Not much change in the UPP. It's going to use the best 48 months for averaging your salary, and it doesn't have to be consecutive. So very similar there. The UPP provision a little more potentially advantageous to members if they have a funny pattern of earnings. The YMPE, this averaging period we talked about, again, we're tying it to the averaging period for the earnings. It's 48 months, so nothing's really changed there. You can see on the screen we mentioned January 1, 2025, and you may not be aware that starting January 1, 2019, you're going to be paying more into the CPP. So are the universities, and over time that's going to mean you're going to be earning more benefits under the CPP. In 2025, there's actually a fairly big bump up in the covered earnings under the CPP, and we've built that into the plan already so that we know what's going to happen when that. Don't forget, we're starting the new plan July 1, 2021, so 2025 will be shortly thereafter, and we've already figured out what we want to do when that happens. So benefit formula, early retirement. Under the current plan, if you are eligible for early retirement, the pension benefit you've earned under the minimum guarantee will be reduced for commencing it before age 65. The reduction varies slightly depending on whether it's for service prior to September 1, 2012 or after September 1, 2012. You can see that the reductions are fairly similar. It's either 2% or 3% for every year between 60 and 65, and 6% for every year between 60 and 55. The 2 and 3% reductions, even though it's a reduction in your pension, are actually subsidized. In other words, it does not represent the full cost of starting your pension early, and as a result, the plan bears some of the cost of that subsidy. For service after July 1, 2021, we're going to have an unreduced pension provision in the plan, and that means that if your age and service add up, age is more than 60, and age and service add up to more than 80, for your service earned under the UPP for service after July 1, 2021, for the pension benefit determined for that service, if you meet the 1680 test, that benefit will not be reduced if you start it prior to normal retirement date. That means that if I've earned a pension at age 60 and I start that pension at age 60 in this category, then there'll be no reduction for the fact that I'm starting at 5 years early. So my pension earned to that early retirement date becomes my pension, and that's paid without any reduction for the early commencement. Your service under the Queen's Plan will count for that 80-point rule. So if I already have 20 years, for instance, in the Queen's Pension Plan, I've already have enough years to meet the 1680. It will count for my eligibility. It doesn't count for the calculation of the benefit, but it counts for meeting the 80-point test. And if you don't meet the unreduced date, then the reduction for this period of service is a flat 5% from 65. So that's the early retirement provisions. Benefit formula, early retirement provisions. The form of payment depends on whether or not you have a spouse at the date your pension commences. So under the current provisions, which will continue into the UPP for your current Queen's service, if you have a spouse at pension commencement date, your pension continues for your lifetime. If you live to 100, your pension will continue to 100. But if you die before receiving 120 monthly payments, the balance of those 120 monthly payments will continue to your beneficiary. You can see why talking about all these types of things, actuaries aren't often invited to barbecues. If you look at your status on your pension commencement date and you have a spouse, the legislation requires that your spouse be covered by a 60% survivor pension. And under the QPP, the Queen's Plan, there is a reduction of typically somewhere between 6 and 8% to your pension to pay for that 60% survivor pension, so that if your spouse at date of pension commencement survives you, then he or she will receive 60% of the pension. Again, I'm a little bit of a broken record here, but just wanting to make the point that continues to apply to your Queen's service, even in the UPP. For the service going forward, if without a spouse at pension commencement date, same benefit as you currently have. With a spouse at pension commencement date, again, there is a requirement for the 60% survivor pension, but a 50% survivor pension is provided at no cost to the members. So the cost to go to a 60% survivor pension is from 50% to 60%. That reduces that 6 to 8% reduction in your pension to about 1 to 2%. So there is more, what it really means is about 80+% of the survivor benefit is in fact subsidized by the plan. And then the last piece on how the benefit is calculated and how the benefit is then adjusted after you start your pension. The Queen's Pension Plan has an indexation formula that applies to the component of your pension that comes from your account balances. It's converted to a pension based on an assumed interest rate of 6%. And then to the extent that the interest of the pension fund earns more than 6%, then your benefit would be indexed for the excess over 6%. If the pension fund earns less than 6%, your pension's not reduced, but you don't get any indexation till the return catches up back to the 6%. For the minimum guarantee supplement, if the minimum guarantee kicks in and you have part of your pension from this minimum guarantee supplement, depending on which period of service it comes from, September 2012 or post-2012, for the pre-2012 service, it's indexed in the same way I just described for the money purchase piece. For the post-2012, September 1, 2012 period, there's no indexation at all. That remains under the UPP as we move it forward, and just as I talked about from a retiree perspective, we'll use the fund rate of return under the UPP for purposes of that calculation, and we may use the rate of return under this QPP if there's not enough years in the average. So there'll be a transition from using the rate of return on the Queen's University Pension Fund over a period of time to a rate of return on the UPP Pension Fund. For service in the future under the UPP, we have something called funded conditional indexation. And let me describe what I mean by that, because there's really three key words there. So first of all, the indexation part. We are targeting to provide members with, after retirement, with 75% of CPI, increase in CPI indexation. So that's the target. The funded part means that when we set the contribution rates, we build into the contribution rates that target of 75% of CPI based on the set of assumptions we're using to calculate those contributions. So that's the funded part. We are providing in the contribution rates contributions to fund towards that indexation if we get the assumptions, or if we get the experience that we expect to get. The conditional part of it is that we do give the plan sponsors the ability to, at any point in time they feel is necessary, and they'll define this in a funding policy, we do give the plan sponsors jointly the decision at a point in time, if the financial conditions of the pension plan warrant, that they would reduce the indexation level going forward below 75 for some period of time. And as a matter of fact, the teacher's plan, pension plan, uses this model, and when we had the financial crisis, they reduced their targeted indexation was 100% down to as low as 60. It wasn't down to 0, it was down to 60% of CPI, and when the fund performance came back, when the markets came back, they increased that indexation back to 100%. And so that's the lever that the plan sponsors, that's the conditionality part. Key point, that any indexation you've been granted to date that's already built into your pension does not get reduced. It's only about reducing future inflation protection going forward for you as an individual. And just to make the transition a little bit easier, we actually have a 7-year period after conversion date where we've agreed not to pull the lever at all. So those are the basic provisions that determine the calculation of your pension. There are a couple of other areas that we need to talk about. We needed to harmonize with the 3 universities, and thinking more broadly as well across the other plans that we're interested in joining. And this relates to the question of can I take my pension entitlement from the pension plan in the form of a lump sum, a commuted value. And under the Queen's plan, I should go back and say from a legislative perspective, you have to allow this up to eligibility for early retirement or age 55. Queen's and a couple of other plans do provide that ability to take the commuted value option over age 55, all the way up to when you have to start your pension at age 71. The UPP is not going to provide that commuted value option going forward, but we do realize that we have to transition out of this. So as you can see in words, and I think the picture is even better, if you look at how we're going to transition out of this, and remember, this is only for individuals who are over early retirement eligibility age. For people under that age, they still have the lump sum option. And I would add, for people over the early retirement eligibility age, we probably see maybe 10% of people who retire use this provision. So we're going to transition out of it. And in the first 3 years after that conversion date, we're going to let people take their total benefit from the QPP and the UPP, take it in a lump sum. For the next 7 years, we're going to let people take the portion from the QPP in a lump sum, and they would take their UPP pension in the form of a pension. So we'll have this period where you'll get some lump sum and some pension, and then after that 10-year period, or what's anticipated to be July 1, 2031, there will be no commuted value or lump sum value option available. So that's one provision we had to harmonize and deal with. The second one relates to the ability to work past age 65 but start your pension. So continuing to work past 65 but then starting your pension while remaining in the employment of the university. And this is one where there are not very many plans in the sector that offer this. None of the other plans in U of T or Guelph offer this. This has been an area where in our discussions with the Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities and the Ministry of Finances, we've had discussions about the plan and what we need from them to be able to make this happen. They've been very clear with us as late as this week that their expectation is that in this new plan there will not be the ability to start your pension while working at the university. Other than at age 71, when under the Income Tax Act you're required to start your pension, and there are people at that point that continue working for the university but start their pension. We realize that we have people currently in the faculty and in other groups who are currently receiving their pension while working at the university. Nothing changes for those people. We realize there are people that are currently over age 65 and haven't made that election yet, but may make that election before they're 71. Nothing will change. They still have that right. And we also realize that people who will be 65 by July 1, 2021 will have that right because they will be eligible at that point. So if you're 65 by July 1, 2021, you'll continue to have that right to be able to make this election. But anyone who's less than 65 on July 1, 2021, there won't be the ability under the UPP to start your pension while continuing working. I'm going to spend a few minutes on examples. This is a challenge to try to come up with examples that one can fit on a chart so you can see them. So I'm glad there's since last week there's new screens over on the side. And two, to try to deal with the fact that there's so many different combinations of how many years you might have at Queen's under the QPP or at Queen's under the UPP. So some of you may have 30 years already and would have a very short period of time under the UPP. Others could be just starting your career here and would have a long period of time under the UPP. So what we decided to do is take a look at the pension earned per year of service. So if you take a look at the chart, we show final salary for individuals. That's their final year's salary. We then show the 4-year average, which is used in the pension calculation, as well as the 4-year average YMPE. And then what we're trying to show is for each year of service you're in the plan, what is the annual pension that's earned for each year of service? So if I look at the $125,000 member, for each year of service in the plan, you earn $1,934 for each of those years. So after 10 years of service, you would have earned a pension of $19,340. If you had a spouse at date of pension commencement, I talked about that reduction in pension to pay for the survivor pension. So the pension would be for that 1 year, $1,820, or in my example, for 10 years, would be $18,200. If you then look at the same pension for the same period of service for 1 year under the UPP, you can see that without a spouse, the benefit is larger, reflecting some of the things I just talked about around the benefit formula and the spousal options. So without a spouse, you can see that instead of $1,934 per year of service, it's $2,173. So a difference between 10 years of service, the difference between $19,340 and $21,730. So it's about a 12% increase. And with a spouse, again, you can see the difference is a little bit larger between the current plan and the new UPP because we also subsidize the survivor pension. So I can summarize that. And again, these are in the presentation that's on the website. It'd be much easier probably to look at them on the website. Just wanted to give you an idea. But if you kind of put that all together and talk about, what are the trade-offs that were being made in terms of not having the hybrid structure going forward, but the greater of the money purchase benefit and the minimum guarantee going forward just to have the defined benefit provision under the plan. And so there's a higher benefit formula, as I talked about. It's approximately a 12% increase in the benefits under the new formula, subject to, as members get impacted by the Income Tax Act maximum pension, that increase mitigates and is lower as you get more impacted by that pension. There's a subsidized survivor pension that would add about 5% to an individual's pension for a member who had a spouse. There's unreduced early retirement, so under the current plan, if you retired at age 60 with 80 points for the current service, the reduction would be 15%. For the new UPP, it would be 0, so there's a potential increase in benefit there. And then the last one is better indexation. Let me explain that because it may take a minute or two to kind of set the stage for this one. I mentioned that the existing Queen's plan indexes pensions to the extent that the rate of return is over 6%. Under the UPP, we've targeted the 75% of CPI. And if we were to earn 6% under the UPP, which is actually a little bit higher than the rate, the return we're expecting in calculating the contribution rates, if we earn 6% under the UPP, for the UPP service, we will be able to provide most, if not all, of the 75% of CPI indexation. At 6% under the QPP, there would be no indexation. You would actually have to earn, to get indexation at 75% of 2% CPI, you would actually have to earn about 7.5% per year in the pension fund to be able to do that. So yes, there is a possibility in the pension fund, the QPP, that indexation could be higher than 75% of CPI. But in that world, in the UPP, we would be having returns that are much in excess of what we have based the funding on, and that would be a world where the plan sponsors would be having much more fun discussions than difficult discussions about how to deal with the funding excess and not a funding shortfall. So I think it's important to make that comparison, because whether we stay with the current plan and modify it or whether we go ahead with a new plan, both those situations are going to be operating in the same investment world. So let me do two things: contribution rates, and then talk a little bit about the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund. So I mentioned earlier the 50-50 sharing of contributions. We've set the contribution rates on an estimated basis for this new plan out in July 1, 2021. We're pretty comfortable that it's very close to what those rates are there. And it would be 9.2% of your salary up to the year's maximum pensionable earnings, which is about, as I mentioned, $56,000 in today's dollars, and 11.5% above that. That would be for both the members and the university. On average, that comes out to about 20% of salary being put away towards pensions across all the members of the universities, each university as well as across the 3 universities. There is a pensionable salary cap because there is a level at which you won't be earning any more pension under the Income Tax Act maximum pension. We've set that at $165,000 this year. Into this year's dollars, we're going to increase that every year as the ITA limit goes up and the pension that you receive under the Income Tax Act maximum pension increases as well. You can see up on the slide that for members, the increase in their contributions, it's 7 below and 9 above the YMPE, and we're going to 9.2 below and 11.5 above. For the university, they're starting a little bit higher, about 0.5% higher, but they too have to take their contributions up from something from the 7.5 and 9.4 up to the 9.2 and 11.5. So it's an increase in contribution from both members themselves and for the university. And as I mentioned earlier, it does not change the special payments that the university also has to make in respect of any going concern deficits that are being brought into the plan. So there's not going to be an elimination of that just by coming into the UPP. So I know you're getting tired of listening to me. And after 16 of these, I may be getting tired listening to myself. But I do want to end with the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund because it's something that we need to tell you about. Many of you may not be even familiar with the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund. Those of us in the pension world talk about it, but it's not one of those things that's known beyond the pension world. It's basically an insurance fund. And what it does is it helps to insure certain amounts of pension benefits for plans that are wound up without sufficient assets where the employer is insolvent. And the two probably most well-known ones in Ontario are Nortel and Sears. It doesn't cover all of the benefits under a plan. It covers benefits up to $1,500 per month. So if your benefits are $1,500 per month or lower, it will top up any shortfall in funding. But if your benefit's over $1,500 a month, anything over $1,500 has no coverage from this fund. The challenge for the universities is that they pay collectively a significant portion of the PBGF premiums because of the size of their pension plans relative to many of the other plans in Ontario. And the premiums are totally unrelated to the risk of what the underlying employer's risk is of becoming insolvent. So Queen's, U of T, Guelph viewed as the same risk as Sears or perhaps a steel company or perhaps Nortel. companies that have had to utilize the PBGF fund, those companies have a much higher risk of insolvency. And so it's not a very good return on investment for the universities to be paying into this fund. A lot of money going in, no benefit to the university or really to the members, quite frankly, because of the risk of insolvency, and we'd like to change that. The advantage of a JSPP is that it does not have PBGF coverage. And there's a reason why it doesn't have PBGF coverage. First of all, they tend to be, as this one will be, multi-employer in nature, which means that if one employer in participating employer becomes insolvent, and in a likely event in the university sector, but let's say it happened, then the plan would continue to operate, and there's no reason to wind up the plan and have to then deal with any shortfall at that point in time. So no trigger of wind up because of the insolvency of one employer. Second protection is that in order to wind up a JSPP, both the employee sponsor and the employer sponsor would have to agree to do this. They're joint sponsors, it's a joint decision, so very unlikely you could get agreement on that to be winding up the plan. Third protection in a JSPP is that any benefits while the plan is operating that are being earned by a member are protected. Accrued benefits are protected. They can't be reduced, even if the plan has a shortfall. So that is a protection as the plan is ongoing. The only time you can reduce benefits under a JSPP is if you were to, unlikely event again, of winding the entire plan up and there was a shortfall. And the last piece of protection is something that's built into the legislation that allows us to do all of this. And basically what it says is that we're going to look at the accrued pension benefits we're transferring from the Queen's plan to the UPP, and we're going to track those in the future. And again, in the unlikely event that Queen's becomes insolvent, and there are so many other problems in the world if that were to happen, not just pension issues, then the university, the assets of the university would have to be available to fund any shortfalls to the extent they existed. So that's the background of why we think that the PBGF coverage is not a good deal for the university sector, and why we think that this JSPP provides members with the similar level of protection from the collective, but doesn't require the universities to pay a lot of money to do that. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Elizabeth, who's going to talk about governance, consent process, regulatory process, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alan. So that was number 16. Congratulations. And good afternoon again. We're almost home on this one. There are 2 sections left to the formal part of the presentation, and then we'll take questions. I'm going to talk about governance and transparency, the new structure for the UPP, and I'll finish with the discussion about consent and the regulatory process. So we have used this particular slide quite a bit in talking about the new structure for the JSPP, the UPP. Just taking a step back, under the current Queen's plan, there is, the structure is a single employer plan. Queen's University is both the sponsor and the legal administrator. And in those 2 functions, Queen's fulfills 2 different roles. The administrator function is a fiduciary role vis-a-vis all of the plan beneficiaries. The sponsor function is the function of Queen's as the employer, responsible for contributions. So under a JSPP, the Pension Benefits Act is very clear on this. And Alan mentioned that the jointly sponsored pension plan is a defined term in the Pension Benefits Act, and that everything about it is joint. So you have joint funding, joint governance, joint sponsorship. And that means shared between employees and employers. So at both the level of sponsorship and at the level of administration, in the new model, in the UPP, there will be shared responsibility. The sponsors must be made up of employees and employers, and likewise the Board of Trustees has to be appointed by the sponsors. So the new joint sponsors will have 3 key responsibilities. The first is to determine contributions and the benefit formula. And in fact, the sponsors have, in a sense, already been working on that. You heard today all of the provisions of the new UPP. Those provisions have been negotiated between the parties, the employers and the employee groups, and those are the provisions that would be in effect at the startup of the plan. Those provisions could change over time, but it would be a joint decision of the new sponsors acting together. The sponsors also have to create something called a funding policy. And the funding policy is very critical in a jointly sponsored pension plan because it determines the actions the sponsors will take depending on the funded status of the plan. And I know we talk a lot about deficit management in a lot of these talks, but it is also, the funding policy also covers management of excesses. So if there are deficits, the funding policy addresses whether contributions will be increased to deal with those deficits, or whether benefits would need to be reduced, or whether the conditional indexing levers that Alan talked about would be invoked. At the same time, if there are excesses, the funding policy would address those and would determine in what circumstances you would be improving benefits or reducing contributions. And of course, both of those scenarios are quite possible under the new regime. The third thing that the sponsors will do is to appoint the administrator. In this case, the parties have determined that the administrator should be and will be a board of trustees. So true trustees of the new fund, which will be made up of all of the funds that have been transferred in from the universities, and including universities still to join. That board of trustees will have an oversight role, much like a board of directors or a board of governors. And the board of trustees will be acting in the best interests of all of the plan beneficiaries, regardless of how the particular trustee was appointed to that board. So this is a very unique role. It is important that this role be the role that is connected to the operation of the plan, the investment of the assets, and the payment of pensions, which are the key roles of the Board of Trustees. Now, at the top of this slide, there's a note that this will be a 2-sponsor model. There are different sponsor models out there. We had the opportunity to meet with all of the jointly sponsored pension plans in Ontario last summer and took from them what we felt was the best of their governance structures. This 2-sponsor model is something the parties felt would be the most effective model for a university sector plan, and I'll explain what that means. So in a 2-sponsor model, you essentially have 2 votes at the sponsor level. One vote is the employee sponsor vote, and the other vote is the employer sponsor vote. Those votes are comprised of or determined by, in each case, a committee. So on the employee side, there will be a committee of 6 individuals, and those individuals will be representative of faculty and representative of unions. On the employer side, there will be a 6-person committee, which will also be representative of the universities participating in the plan. Initially, there will be only 3 universities. Each of them will have 2 committee seats, and 3 of those 6 will be permanent, one for Queen's, one for Guelph, and one for the University of Toronto. On the employee side, 3 of the seats will be faculty, 1 will be Steele, and the other 2 will be other union seats, based upon membership numbers. So in this kind of a structure, both sides work through their own committee and come up with their one vote. And this drives consensus. It makes sure that the parties are always working towards coming together on a decision, and it takes you out of sort of a voting regime. Now, when the Board of Trustees is created, then each sponsor will have the ability to appoint to that Board of Trustees. And the Board of Trustees will have a variety of expertise, knowledge, background. It's important that this Board of Trustees be capable and competent to undertake the tasks that are required of it, including the investment of the assets, payment of benefits, and determination of liabilities of the plan. So the employee sponsor will appoint 6 trustees. The employer sponsor will appoint 6 trustees. The non-unionized employees of the plans will have a representative who will sit as a trustee, and that representative will have a vote but not a tying vote. So now I'm up to 13. The 14th trustee will be the independent chair, and this independent chair will be the one trustee who is appointed jointly by both sponsors. And that chair will be in effect for the first 7 years in order to ensure a very smooth transition to this new structure. And, and to also really focus on consensus building between these parties. Now, it's anticipated that the new Board of Trustees will be up and running, and well, maybe not running, up and in place by January 1, 2020. Alan mentioned July 1, 2021, and I just want to take a minute and clarify these dates because I realize this can cause some confusion. The plan is to actually register the new jointly sponsored pension plan January 1, 2020. So that's a brand new shell plan registered federally and provincially. The Board of Trustees would then be the legal administrator of this plan on that day. But there will be no assets, no members, no contributions. All of you and everybody at Queen's and U of T would remain in their existing plans until such time as this new plan is ready and open for business, which we anticipate to be July 1, 2021. So the Board of Trustees would have time to undertake due diligence around determining who will provide the payroll, sort of the contribution collection system, who the custodian will be, how the assets will be managed and invested, and as well how the liabilities will be valued going forward. So there's a lot of work to do to set up a plan of this nature. There's a lot of expertise already housed in all 3 institutions, and that will be harnessed. So as that process is going on, there will also be a need to have the superintendent of financial services review this whole package and determine that the assets and the liabilities and the benefits payable can all move over. And we would like to make that happen on the same day, the July 1, 2021. So that's why nothing changes until July 1, 2021, but behind the scenes, a lot of work is getting done in order to make sure that the plan is ready to provide seamless coverage on that day. So that's governance. And the final bit is about consent. A big question that we always get is, do I have any say in this? And the answer is yes. With respect to this plan, and this is a plan-wide requirement, it's not, now, we have 5 plans, and we've been talking about 5 plans, but for each of the plans, the following requirements apply. 2/3 of all active members of the existing plan must consent, and no more than 1/3 of the retired members, former members, and other persons entitled to benefits under the plan can object. In addition, the conversion, that conversion I talked about, of the assets and the liabilities, has to be approved in advance by the Superintendent of Financial Services. Okay, unionized members. If you are a unionized member, your union must determine whether to consent on your behalf. If your union consents on your behalf, then you are deemed as an individual to consent. If your union does not consent, you're deemed not to consent. In order to confirm or determine those consent votes, which are held by the union and must be exercised by the union alone, Faculty and Steel will be seeking ratification of their members in late January and early February 2019. So that's the union process. For retired and former members of the plan, former members are those people who no longer work at Queen's, but they have an entitlement still in the plan. We used to call them deferred vested members. Retired and former members of the plan are in one group. For that group, even if you were unionized when you were employed, that union will not be consenting on your behalf. Instead, you will have an individual right to object. If no more than 1/3 of that entire group objects, then the process can go forward, provided the active threshold has been met. And for non-unionized members of the plan, if you're non-unionized, you have an individual right to consent. Your consent will then be added to all of the deemed consents by virtue of the union consents. If 2/3 or more of the active members of the current plan consent or are deemed to consent in the case of unionized members, then the active member consent threshold will be met. And as long as the inactive objection threshold is met, or non-objection threshold is met, the process can proceed. If those thresholds are met, then the next step is for the university to prepare and file an application with the Financial Services Commission of Ontario that regulates this entire process. And at that point, the university will have to establish a number of things. Firstly, it will have to show that it provided notice of the conversion to all members of the plan. So there is a notice that goes out to every individual, regardless of whether you're unionized. It goes to everybody, retired, active, union, non-union. And what that notice shows is your accrued entitlement in your current plan, and on day one of the UPP, what your accrued entitlement in that UPP will be. And those numbers are going to be identical for everyone at Queen's, because at Queen's, Guelph, and U of T, the benefits for past service are not being converted, they are not being changed, they are being moved in as they exist today, and those provisions are being honored. So the notice provision asks, you're required to show that, and this is a regulatory requirement that applies to all conversions going on in the province. And in some of the conversions that are going on elsewhere, not in the university sector, members' past service benefits are being converted into JSPP benefits, and that's not what's happening here. So the notice is really going to show you the same number twice. The notice will also then outline all of the changes that we have discussed today that are harmonized provisions for the future service. The university is also required to establish that it is not altering the commuted value of benefits that are being moved over, and as we've shown and as we've indicated, there isn't going to be a conversion of those benefits, so the commuted value isn't going to be different, it's going to be the same. And the other thing that the university has to show, most importantly, is that those consent thresholds were met. There has to be a proof that the consents were actually obtained in the numbers that the university says they were. So that's that process. Once that application goes into the Superintendent of Financial Services, we expect the superintendent will take several months, based on past practice, to review the whole application. Following that, the superintendent will approve it. However, the plan is, as discussed, not to move assets or the startup of the new plan, to have all of that start at the same time, July 1, 2021. So what's the timing? Just to review again. Faculty and Steel ratifications January to mid-February 2019. Those notices I talked about, the individual notices, have to go out to everybody by the end of March. And then there is a 90-day consent window, and that closes at the end of June 2019. Assuming that is positive, the application to transfer the assets and liabilities will be made by the end of 2019 with the new JSPP registered January 1, 2020. Contributions under the UPP would start after regulatory approval for transfer of existing plan assets and the startup and all of that other work that I said needed to get done by the Board of Trustees, all anticipated to be July 1, 2021. Sounds simple when you put it up on one slide like that. So that, in a quick summary way, that is the process that we're undertaking. I'm sure there are questions. Just another note about the UPP website, where this presentation has been posted and where there are other there's other information that you can obtain, especially if you register, and then you can get an email when there's something new posted. But immediately, right now, we will have a question session, as we did at our first session earlier today, and we'd love to hear from people who haven't had a chance to ask questions previously, and I'll turn it back to Donna, who is going to moderate that session. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth and Alan. And so we're right up at the, so we'll get started. Everyone's anxious.
Thank you. Thank you very much for doing this routine so many times for our benefit. So appreciate you coming. I'd like to ask a question about something that arose this morning, which is the age 65 issue. Perhaps we could turn to your slide 20, I think, which is the one that describes it. Is it possible to do that?
Can you go back?
That's it. That's it. Thank you. All right. So as you described, we have a number of people at the university right now who are over 65, who are still working, who are getting both their pension and their salary. And the proposal, as I understand it, will eliminate the ability to do that. And the difference will be assuming a pension of about $100,000. That would be 6 years. Assuming you stayed on, that will be a $600,000 loss for each individual person who was going to work after 65. The question really is, why would the members of CUFA want to agree to that? A lot of the plan that you described makes a lot of sense, but that aspect in particular, you spoke about consent and the degree of consent that's required to move forward with this. What is happening right now, in its early stages, but what's happening right now is that there are now rumblings of discontent amongst members of CUFA, and what may happen is that those members will get on CUFA's case to say, what are you thinking? This represents at least a $500,000 loss for every one of us that we're planning to work past 65. You are representing us, and we will not have you agree to this. So my question for you is, if you were CUFA and you heard this from your members, what would be the response?
Okay, are you finished?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that question again. We had that this morning as well, and we're happy to deal with it again. And I'll start, and then Alan may have a response for you on your numbers. I'm not going to respond to you on your numbers. You raise a really good point. I think, at least our understanding is that many CUFA members don't actually double dip, as I think you called it.
I didn't, but it is commonly called that.
Yeah, it's been called that. I guess one of the there's a couple of issues, and Alan mentioned a couple of them when he went through this slide earlier. I think the most significant issue is that the Government of Ontario, the support of which is needed to move to this model, which is I think is a very important opportunity to maintain a defined benefit pension plan in the sector for all members of the sector. The Government of Ontario is unfortunately very, very opposed to this practice. I don't know why. I do know that in many meetings I've been in on this matter over the past several years with many of my colleagues who can say the same thing, the question has been asked repeatedly about these provisions. And as recently as this week, we were asked to confirm that the new plan would not contain a provision such as this. So I think what we have to deal with is that reality, that there are, as you've said, many positive features to this plan. You've also heard, I think, today, Donna Janiak say that the current plan at Queen's is not sustainable, the model is not sustainable. I know that when many people were hired here, there was still mandatory retirement, as you know, that only went away in 2005 or 6. So in fact, the opportunity to work past 65 is relatively new in and of itself. And the provisions of the plan that apply to people who did retire because they had to, would have then automatically triggered the payments. So I think that you obviously have made a point that is a good point that will be of concern to some people, but I think there are a lot of other features of the plan that others may want to take into account in their consideration. It's not the other thing I want to mention is there is an important transition provision, and I'm glad we've got the slide up, because there is a very important transition period that we have told the government about, and we've said we really don't think this can be taken away from anybody who is already receiving a pension or anybody who will be 65 by the time the plan starts. And I think we've pushed hard to make sure that that was acceptable, and I think that's hopefully that people do appreciate that transition is there, and I don't want that to be lost. So maybe I'll just let Alan make a couple comments, and then you might have another comment.
Yeah, so just on this issue of the government's position on it, and again, as Elizabeth said, and I alluded to, they've been really focused on this one. They've been focused on it not only in the context of the UPP, but just in general. We've had through the Council of Ontario Universities, which
Louder.
yeah, sorry. We've had through the Council of Ontario Universities questions about this and what each university does. So I'm not convinced that even if you were to keep the current plan, I'm still not convinced that the government won't push on this one, even in the current model. And quite frankly, if this was one of the reasons the entire process failed, I think they would in fact look at that and say, well, if that's the reason it failed because people weren't willing to give that up, we may push on it even under the current model. So that's number one. Number two, and I think this is always a challenge in a JSPP, which is to the extent that you think, and I'm going to talk about the numbers in a minute, that this is a $600,000 plus benefit to an individual, it's $600,000 more cost to the entire plan. So in a JSPP, that gets shared between the members and the university. So if there is a cost to this, it is going to be a shared cost. And then on the numbers, and I haven't had time, to spend on them, and I will take a look at them, but I think a couple things that have to be sort of factored in. So you have the additional payments for that 6-year period. You have to then reflect the fact that if you have a pension of $100,000 and you're probably then earning $150,000 or maybe a little bit more, that there are contributions that won't be going in on your behalf of probably $18,000, $20,000 a year, and the pension for that $100,000 maybe if by the time you age 71, if you had not started it, may be $120,000, and so you're going to get paid $20,000 more for 15 years. So we could go back and forth on the numbers. I brought my HP 12C in case a calculation broke out on a Friday afternoon, but I don't, I think to your point, I think to assess sort of the impact on an individual, I think it might be worthwhile to go through all of those points, because I think making a blanket statement that it's $600,000 a member is a problem to me. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm not saying it's zero, but I think we should have a discussion about the quantum.
Well, first on the numbers. So I didn't say 6. I said it was $600,000 in payments, and then the net loss would be about $500,000. So the increase that you're referring to in the future pension because of the extra contributions during that 6-year period will, as you say, increase the pension payment. But it won't make up for $600,000. It might be about $100,000, which is why I picked $500,000. And there's no going around it. There's going to be a substantial loss for these people that is measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm sure you don't dispute that. The response that I'm hearing from you, twofold. The first one is that the real objection to this is nothing but political, that they don't like the way it looks. And that may be true. It may be absolutely true. But that's not our problem. Our problem is that we're losing $500,000. And so I hear you, and it may be a problem for the people who are putting the plan together. but we have self-interest. And one way to deal with that self-interest is to find another way to compensate us for the loss of $500,000. The other point I wanted to challenge is the idea that getting our pension at 65, even if we keep working, is a cost to the plan. Now, sure, the money comes out of the plan, but we've been contributing to the plan on the assumption that it's a pension we get at 65. It costs nobody anything if we keep working. That's irrelevant. We have paid for a pension to start at 65. And if we decide to work at the university or somewhere else for that matter, that activity and that salary costs nobody anything. So the idea that it's costing the pension plan extra money is completely false.
So I'm just going to add to that, and we can go back and forth. And when you fund the pension plan, if you take a look, I know you don't want to read an actual report, but it does. I mean, it does assume in the cost of the plan. We don't, since the elimination of mandatory retirement, we have not assumed in valuing university pension plans that everyone's going to start their pension at 65. We have absorbed some of the increased cost of longevity, which has driven up the cost of pension plans significantly. We've absorbed some of that in the funding of the plan by assuming that people would retire later as well. If we assume everyone goes at 65 in the Queen's pension plan, and we assume that what's happened is people are just living longer and longer, the cost is just going to rise even faster and faster. So I think the starting point is that when we fund the plan, we're not assuming anymore that everyone goes at 65, and I think that so that's one of the nuances of the way we fund the existing plan. So just raise that point. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I echo my colleagues. Thanks for this presentation, and I'm asking about early retirement. And I wondered, is there a way for people who are like the in-betweeners to figure out using a magic graph that somebody who really does math might have when we could retire if we were to take the something but earlier than 65? So that's one question, because I think that for a lot of people here at Queen's, it is a kind of an interesting idea to think about a change in the plan such that we wouldn't necessarily need to wait until 65. So if we're, if you want to sweeten the bitterness of my lovely colleague Bruce, then that could be an option. That's one. So that's one question I had, and then the other one was, I was a little concerned in terms of the discussion of solvency, and you did a good job talking about how universities are more stable than Sears and so forth. I still am nervous about plan sponsors have agreed not to reduce indexation below 75% level in the first 7 years. And then you gave the example, if I heard you correctly, that previously when the markets were requiring it, the change was made such that it was a 60% rather than a 75% indexation. But I want to know, how low can it go, right? Because that's what's relevant. Once you retired and then, there is actually no true security. Because I think that that's what we love about the pension, is we feel like we're going to be secure in retirement. Thanks.
So a couple thoughts. First of all, when I talk about the indexation, it never is below zero. I mean, your pension never decreases. So indexation is only an item in the new plan that increases your benefit. So at no point, if you had started with a $30,000 pension and it had been indexed for 3 or 4 years by 75% of CPI and it was now up at $35,000, nothing changes the $35,000. Even if the indexation went to zero, you would still get $35,000. It just wouldn't increase in that year. And then maybe 3 years from now, everything improves, and maybe you get an increase from 35 to 36. But if it goes to zero, there's no reduction in your pension that you're receiving. It's only whether it will be increased in the future. I should add that in a world where there was zero inflation protection in this new plan, there would be zero inflation protection and then a big problem in your existing plan. So in a world where we don't earn enough to provide 75% of CPI, or even let's say 50% of CPI, is a world where the investment returns are not very high, and in that world, your existing plan, as they say, would be in a whole pile of hurt, because there would be no, sorry, I keep moving away here, there would be no indexation for a long time for pensioners, and it would be very doubtful whether we could afford the conversion at the rate we do it. So, but I think the most important point in the new plan, if it goes below 75%, if it goes down as low as zero, it doesn't impact anything you're already receiving. It doesn't impact anything you're already receiving.
Sorry if this is remedial, but I was under the impression that you have to have an index fund in order to keep up with cost of living. And so that's why I'm confused. So because if in the first 7 years you've agreed not to reduce indexation below 75%, then what's the lowest in like year 8? How low could it go?
Could be zero. Could be zero.
But so then it's the case. So is your point that then we would be in Armageddon, and so I wouldn't need to worry about it? Because if it's just my income, then like my pension is not enough. For me to be posh and plush in retirement, I need to have my income plus indexation, right? I think that's because isn't that the difference?
But you don't have that under the current plan. You don't have that guarantee now.
Yeah, I was about to say, Alan, maybe Bob can say, like, there's many pensioners that haven't had increases for 10 years under the Queen's plan. And so those that went out, right around or right after the crash, they haven't had increases for about 10 years under the Queen's pension plan, because they have to have increases of 6% a year for over 6 years. And so under the UPP, you are going to be getting these increases at 75% of CPI, unless the market crashes again. But it would only be temporary until it came back up, whereas it's been a long time under the Queen's pension plan, because we have to have these very high increases to be able to get pension increases.
Yeah, or another way, I think I probably, in the presentation, could have said it probably more directly, which is there's a much higher probability in this structure that your pension will be increased after retirement than there is in the existing structure. I think that's a good way of looking, because if you're worried about inflation protection and your pension increasing after retirement, my view is that there's a much higher probability that you'll get inflation protection at a meaningful level in the new provision compared to the existing one.
Okay. And then to my first question before we pass it over, about the early retirement.
Do you want, well, I can, so the early retirement provisions right now are for the benefits that you earn while in the university pension plan, the unreduced early retirement provisions. And so for any benefits that you earn after 2021 in the university pension plan, those will be unreduced. If you're 60 and you have 20 years of service, including your service under the Queen's pension plan. But it would only be for the benefits earned under the university pension plan.
And I would add that for a longer service person who has some of their minimum guarantee provision under the pre-2012 service, the reduction of 2% per year, so it would be 10% to go at age 60, is still very subsidized. I mean, the reduction would typically be 5 or 6% to be what I would call a full actuarial reduction, where there's no cost to the plan. The 2% per year from 60 to 65, or the 3% per year from 60 to 65, I realize it's not unreduced, but those reductions are not are much lower than the real cost of retiring early. So even if you had the 2% for a big chunk of your service, it's still worth looking at, because that's still a subsidized reduction.
Okay, so I can make the decision certainly to retire early, but if is it the case that because I came in before this shift, my first opportunity for unreduced, like not taking a small financial hit or large financial hit, is 65? It's not, oh, I can do 62 because, right? Whereas my colleague could be
under
at
the
60.
current plan, under the current plan, it's 65. You're right. You can't, if you start your pension under the current plan before 65, there is a small reduction. Under the UPP, if you start your pension before 65 with the 80 points for that service, there'll be no reduction. That's right.
So you can retire before 65, but your service, but the unreduced is only for the time that you were in the university pension plan.
But
the
for
new
that
pension
period, you would get the unreduced. So if you're in the UPP for 10 years in the future, you'll get the unreduced pension on those 10 years of service.
Everybody else seems to understand it, so I'll ask Elizabeth.
If I remember correctly, in the contribution increases, it was 2.2 below YMPA and 2.5 after YMPA. What's the corresponding increases that the U of T faculty are paying?
Yeah, it's a little over 2 as well.
And they have, oh, faculty, yes.
Yeah, so U of T faculty would be paying a little over 2%. There is a difference between, and this is one of the issues of going across the 3 universities. In the Queen's situation, the increase in member contributions is accompanied by an increase in university contributions, a little bit lower, but still an increase. In the U of T situation, the increase in member contributions would be accompanied by a reduction in the university contribution. So it's a bit of a different dynamic at U of T and Queen's because they're starting out with a slightly higher benefit than Queen's has.
I understand that they've negotiated a 1.8% pension offset to accompany their pension contribution increase. Is that something we could expect at Queen's?
We're discussing, we're bargaining in terms of getting to the consent vote with all of the employee groups. So, of course, we're not going to talk about that here.
And just one question that on one of the last slides, you mentioned that there's some date at which we'll get a notice about how much our QPP is worth going into the new plan. Was that, I think it was December 31st date, or was that?
It's the data for that is as at September 30th of 2018.
Okay.
But those notices will be distributed at the end of March in 2019. So it's information that will look very much like what you will get on your annual statement.
But will that value change prior to July 1st, 2021?
Only it will increase because you'll earn more benefits under the QPP.
But if there's a crash in February of 2021, it won't affect the value going forward?
Oh, it will, because it'll affect your money purchase account. Your plan will be exactly as it is now, subject to anything that you might collectively bargain about the plan. The plan will be exactly as it is now up until the anticipated date of July 1, 2021.
Okay, so you're only giving information on the minimum guarantee?
No, the account balances will be on that notice as well.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you for this. I have a couple of questions. I just want to revisit the, and I hate the term double dipping, but that provision. If we look at our unit, we have staff who retire. They start taking their pension, and then we beg them, please, please, please come back because we have this that needs to be done, and we won't have to train you in the software or what we're doing here. Usually on a contract basis as opposed to a permanent employee basis, but it could be a small amount. We do the same with faculty. Please, 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 will you come back and develop a course or teach a course or do something, as opposed to a full salaried individual. Is there a difference?
There is a difference. I would refer to what you're speaking about as reemployment of a retired member. Whereas the provision that we've been addressing and that was addressed by the gentleman at the beginning of the question period is about continuing in full-time employment, and I think it's largely faculty, but not exclusively faculty. To the extent people do that, and it's not a large number, that is just a continuation of full-time employment with all the same terms and conditions of employment while collecting the pension.
So I'm gonna. This is good, but I'm gonna suggest to whomever that I've heard people come back into my unit not understanding that. So staff and other faculty. So in the information that goes out, there was a definite feeling that that was not allowable either. So in the information that's on the
Right.
website and so on, make that the distinction clear.
We will
Okay.
have to, because it's absolutely different, yes.
Yeah. I have another question which the CUFA folks are going to look at me and say, oh my God, I knew she was going to get up and say this. So I was born in July, and the current provision for faculty in the current QPP is that I have to work 11 and a half months past my birthday in order to have an unreduced pension. In other words, I have to work to age 66. Human rights issue from my perspective, whereas I have another faculty member in the office next to me born in June and only has to work another month after age 65 to have an unreduced pension. I am going to strongly encourage that the UPP move a provision in, however they do it, to say every single faculty member at this place from today can retire at age 65 and their birth date does not affect it.
That is one of the provisions that's being harmonized, because you might not be surprised to hear this, but 5 pension plans, at least 3 different ways of figuring out what the normal retirement date is.
So we have addressed it in the UPP.
It's changed, it's fixed. So it will be the end of the month in which you turn age 65.
Great, great. And I am going to suggest a sweetening of the pot for, I just went to something, reaping the harvest. We who are old and ugly. I have another 5 years to go, but if to age 65, but if there was something where there was another round of early retirement offers to get the high-priced help off your books and to make fewer people on the QPP when 2020 rolls around, this would be probably positive for everybody going to the UPP and for those of us who are old and ugly.
Thank you.
Okay, one thing I was wondering, it seems to me, can one characterize what's going on here in terms of, if you look at the contribution levels, they're going up, say, between Queens, the pension, or the employees plus the university, it's on the order of about 18%, and it's going up to something on the order of about 23%. But the benefits are, so that's about on the high 20s and percentage-wise, but the benefits going up by about 12%. So to make everything solvent, we're basically paying a lot more for this whole thing. Is that sort of a way to think about why this is, there is some risk averaging, but it seems like our costs are, we're contributing way more, and the university's contributing way more.
Well, I think the total contributions, like current service, I forget the deficit payments for members and the university at Queen's is about 15%, and for currently, without the special payments, and you're right, it will go up to 20%, so there is a...
Well, it's 11.5 from each university. And
yeah, but it's 9.2 up
above.
to
Well,
it averages. It averages.
Slightly
Believe it or
slightly
not,
less
just
than that,
given
yeah.
the range of pays across the university, it actually averages out about 10% for both members. So I've kind of been using 15 and 20. The one thing, and so one of my comments at an earlier session was if you take 15% away, pay away, put it in a pension plan, and invest it, and you put 20% of salary in a pension plan and invest it, and you're assuming they're invested in the same way in the same environment, there's a high probability that the 20% is going to provide higher pensions. I think one thing that clouds the number a bit that makes, and I understand your comparison, is the value of the value of indexation. You don't see it in the initial numbers. So if we earn 6% and we pay 75% of CPI indexation, that value of the 75% of CPI is 15 to 20% of the value of the benefit. That's the hidden piece that I think in your comparison is missing, and it's hard to see in the examples.
No, I'm just saying
yeah,
it's
but it's a good point.
characterized-
It's the one piece of this is that when I compare the starting pensions, it looks like it's it's maybe somewhere between 15 and 20%, but this indexation afterwards is part of the big reason for the cost increase. I would say, don't quote me exactly, but I would say of that 20%, the indexation part of those contribution rates probably costs somewhere between 3 and 4%. So much higher probability you'll pay indexation, but it is, the value of that is, it's really hard to show, and to your point, your examples, it is hidden, and it really makes that comparison that you're talking about a lot closer.
Okay, and one thing that hasn't been mentioned, it seems like in the UPP, eliminating the fact that you can't take the money out, like you can't have the commuted value option is gone completely. I guess there's a transition, but I'm wondering why is that? Like some people, for example, maybe they think maybe they're not going to live very long, something like that. It just seems sort of odd. Is that a cost? Is it costing? Any?
Well, so first of all, just for clarification, I mean, it is only for people over age 55, not under 55. It's kept there. Not everyone offers it. It is a cost factor. I mean, pension plans are some pooling of risk, and if all the people that are going to live to 100 take a pension, and all the people that know they aren't well take a lump sum, it's going to cost a lot more over time. So we have to be a little careful that we put a set of provisions in that doesn't cause people to select the most that option in a way that drives up the cost of the plan. And then the third thing is there just hasn't been, from the data we've seen, there isn't a big uptake on this issue. Like I think I mentioned, I think about 10% of the retirements at Queen's across all groups. I think that's right, Bob. Take this lump sum. So it's also not been a big, a highly utilized provision. So in harmonizing it, that's the reason it's a cost issue, it's a harmonization issue, and it's also a low utilization issue.
I just wanted to echo the concern of one of the gentlemen who spoke before me about the increase in payments. Looking at the table, you can see that there is definitely an increased amount in the UPP, and to me, that is just the increased amount of members paying more into the plan. And it seems like the members are taking on some of the cost of making this a similar but stable version of a plan with similar benefits.
I mean, I guess the benefits are increasing, and so I think that is part of it. So it's the indexation, it's the spousal benefit, increased spousal benefit, increased benefits. So those are all elements, and unreduced early retirement. And I know for us that are already here, I won't get much benefit from that either, but for the future, that's one of those are the additional benefits that will be in this new plan. So it is more expensive to get into this plan.
But I think one part of the comparison, and this is a hard issue to deal with because we don't know what the other path is, but I think, in making the comparison of where you're going in the contribution levels, I think it's maybe a little bit problematic to assume that if you were to maintain the current plan, then nothing would change, that we'd be able to provide the same level of benefits at the same cost. It likely is an increased cost, or we would have to provide with the same cost lower benefits. And I think that's a bit of a challenge in making this decision. We realize for individuals is the other path, and Donna talked about the sustainability of the existing plan. It's not clear what that path would be, but we know from having been at this since 2012, it's likely not exactly the current plan. So recognize the point, but I think the comparison sort of needs to be, consider the fact that the current plan may not stay in exactly in its current form.
Thank you for your presentations. So when I was at a similar meeting a year ago, there were 6 universities intending to participate and 2 observing universities. So where did King's College go? Where did Trent go? Where did Wilfrid Laurier go? Do they know something we should know?
That's a very good question. I can take a crack, and then Donna, you can.
No, go ahead.
They very kindly agreed to stand down while Queen's, Guelph, and U of T committed to getting this across the finish line. As you can probably imagine just from this presentation today, it is an enormously complicated task dealing with 5 plans, let alone 10 or 12 at once. We have many, many employee groups, and there are a lot of different stakeholder interests involved. So we actually have a monthly call, and all of those that you've named very loyally come on that call, and they are very keen and very interested in the work that's being done. And I will say, very grateful to Queen's, University of Toronto, and Guelph for taking the lead to really put the meat on the bones of the plan. So I don't think you should view that as a lack of interest or that they know something that you should know, but rather that it became unworkable with 6 + 2.
And I can say quite unequivocally that the presidents had to talk, and because everyone wanted to be there at the very beginning, and are waiting for this to happen so that they can move in.
So is it possible, though, that they will now sit back, wait, see how it works for Queen's, U of T, and Guelph, and then make the decision later on to join or not join? And if that's true, why isn't Queen's taking the same approach? Why are we leading the way? Why don't we wait and see how it goes?
Because I think that along with those others, they wanted to be here leading the way. We felt that with the 3 particular universities, we had similar employee groups, and we felt that those 3, and we all strongly, felt that we wanted to move forward, and so that's why those 3 ended up paving the way. But I mean, and who knows what they will do in terms of moving forward, but I know in talking to my colleagues at those universities, a few of them are definitely they want to be there right at the very beginning, as soon as they can. So Queen's wanted this to happen, and so we wanted to be part of the initial wave.
We also talked about the fact that from a sponsorship perspective, Queen's, University of Toronto, and Guelph will have founding seats on the sponsors committee, and those seats will be permanent regardless of how many other universities join. And I think that having put the time and effort and the commitment into this, that is actually an advantage and a benefit.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Hi, I just have a clarification question. I want to make sure I understood something correctly about the commuted value. If you are under the age of 55 come July 1st, 2021, and the plan is approved, the UPP is approved, you have until 55? Like there's no compensation for your years put in under the old plan, it's just the new plan, you have until 55 to take the commuted value, is that correct?
Yeah, if I
I
understand.
just want to make sure I
Yeah, if I
understand.
understand the question correctly, if you leave the university before age 55 in 10 years, and you're, let's say, 54 in 10 years, and you leave the university, the benefit payable under the combined plan is available as a lump sum. So we'll look at when you're 55 under in the future.
So if you hit 55, you're under 55 on July 2021.
Yeah.
You hit 55, at that point, you no longer have the option for
Yes,
commuted value
that's right.
in the new
That's
plan.
right.
There's
Yeah.
no extension
There's no
based
extension,
on years
right?
in
Yeah.
the old plan.
Other than if you're in that transition period.
Only if you're
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make sure. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the meeting. I'm not speaking only for myself when I say that many people who are probably in their 50s and older are very disappointed to know that the early retirement provisions that they had heard about will not apply to them. And that people were actually very excited about this potential, and there is this widespread collective disappointment floating around the older faculty, which I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear. Not everybody wants to keep working after they're 65 or even 60.
You're confusing us a lot. The whole, yeah, we're just having trouble figuring out when anyone.
And so I know that at other universities, I know I have colleagues at York, they have some kind of step-down version of retiring a little. I guess this question for Donna. Retiring a little bit at a time. Could you trade us that for our disappointment?
Well, I know it's one of the things that CUFA wants to talk about, so I mean, we will talk about it. It's all part of the bargaining process. But yes, I mean, we're hearing from all staff. I mean, you hear about unreduced early retirement, and of course, everyone. And so every time we go into one of these things, I hate to do it, but you know, but it's true. It is only for and almost all staff, because that's who's coming to these presentations, the ones that are nearing their retirement. And so I know it's very disappointing, and we've heard you, and it's disappointing to me too, because our colleagues in the plan, they will all have it because they currently have it at their universities right now. So yes,
I don't know whether that's something that you know, the current plan. One of the things that also concerns people is that our union has been able to negotiate around pensions for us, and we're going to lose that. I don't know if I'm looking at my union comrades over here. Maybe they could do something for the next couple of years. But yeah, people have been spending the last year adding up their little formulas. And at the very least, I don't even know what you call that. I just know that the phased-in retirement or the step-down or whatever is certainly something else that people have wanted for a long time. And it might curtail feelings of bitterness that are floating around. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just had a quick clarification question, and you've likely already covered this, but if I were to take my early retirement at 60, my accrued, I would receive the reduction in what I'd previously, like the QPP, there would be a deduction, that reduction of the 5 years in my previous QPP, but the UPP would be reduction free. Okay,
correct.
Thank you.
If you had the factor, but yes. Are there any other questions anyone has? Well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon, and we really appreciate it, and have a great weekend, everyone.